Unicorn Overlord was the first new game of the year that really captured my attention, and boy did it suck me in. My attention was constantly on Unicorn Overlord until I finished the game, and for quite a while afterwards as well, and my situation was not unique. Many of my friends who played the game expressed similar sentiments. The game was incredibly well received and sold very well by the standards of its developer Vanillaware. So is a sequel something that could happen? And if so, what would it look like? I will tackle both of those questions in this video from my own perspective. Obviously, I would love to get an insight into the decision makers' heads at Vanillaware to see what they would want for a sequel, but since that is not yet possible, I'll just talk about what I would want from a Unicorn Overlord 2. Unicorn Overlord is a strategy RPG developed by Vanillaware and published by Atlas or Sega depending on region. The game took inspiration from 90s RPGs, especially the Ogre Battle series, and Unicorn Overlord was received quite well upon release. With strong reviews and sales, still no confirmation of the game hitting the million sales number yet, but I imagine that is coming in due time. Unicorn Overlord was a significant hit for Vanillaware, which is good since the studio nearly went bankrupt developing it over the last decade or so. If a sequel does happen, let's hope they don't have to spend another decade developing that game. For now, let's talk about the story of Unicorn Overlord and what they might do with a sequel. Unicorn Overlord had an ambitious story when it came to scope. The Liberation Army traveled across 5 different nations, freeing them all over the course of the game. A grand adventure to be sure, and given the way the story began with Sonoira's rise and conquering of pretty much the entire known world, this structure made a lot of sense. For a sequel, what I would like to see is a more focused story and narrative on this front, perhaps focusing on one single country, but in order to maintain the drama, adding in more counterpunches from the enemy. This could be incorporated into the gameplay at a meta strategy level, but for now I'll focus on the story aspect. In Unicorn Overlord, every time we took back territory or an entire country from Sonoira never fought back. We were never put on the back foot, and I think that was a missed opportunity for storytelling. For the next narrative, then, having a real push and pull on who was in control, who the momentum was behind, would make for an exciting and different story than we had in the first game. That's the biggest change I would like to see for the story in the sequel. I think the setting itself is great. Love the medieval era fantasy and all of the different races that populated the land. They could, of course, go further with the races such as introducing dragonfolk like Eowyn Chronicle had, or more traditional fantasy races such as dwarves or halflings. They could even take more inspiration from Ogre Battle, who had some interesting additional fantasy races. But that would just be a bonus on top of the already interesting and well-constructed races. I'd also be interested in seeing a different sort of protagonist than Elaine. He was great, but he also very much fit that typical strategy RPG protagonist niche. With experience and a better base to build on for a sequel, I'd love to see Vanillaware take a risk and try a different sort of protagonist. Whether that's a non-royal one, a non-human one, or even an older protagonist. The options are there, and making that change could lead to a unique perspective and set a sequel apart from the other games in the genre. To summarize, what I want to see is Vanillaware maintain the base of setting and world building that they started with Unicorn Overlord, and take some more risks on character writing and narrative structure. It would also benefit them if they chose to do a new land instead of setting it in the same place as the first game. The unifying myth of the unicorn between the lands could serve as the series staple moving forward, and then they can tinker around more with the political history and makeup of the world. The world is their oyster, if they choose to capitalize on it. As for gameplay, I'll start with the meta strategy level that I was talking about earlier. I really liked the aspects of Unicorn Overlord that played with this, such as rebuilding towns and garrisoning troops. To add on to that, I think there could be enemy groups that could roam around and attack the towns that you've liberated. That could give another reason for garrisoning your troops around, because then they could lead the defense of that town, and then you have more mission variety as well. I think having different goals for certain missions will help keep the gameplay fresh and offer new chances to test a player's ability, and defend or escape missions could certainly do that. Plus, this addition would contribute to the feeling that the enemies are actually planning and trying to take back territory instead of just letting all of their towns, forts, and cities go as soon as they lose them. When it comes to the actual fighting in the battles, there are a couple things that I would like to see. The first is mainly UX related. Since Unicorn Overlord is a console exclusive game, there are some steps the developers have to take to make controlling armies and individual units easier. PC-focused RTS games don't have to do these things because you have more control via the mouse and keyboard than you do for a standard controller. But unless Vanillaware really changes their ideas on PC ports, that's not likely to be a factor for a sequel. What I would like, that is actually realistic for Unicorn Overlord 2, is for a menu that allows you to select multiple units to direct them to particular areas on the map. Early on, this isn't an issue with only a couple units deployed at a time, but towards the end, when you may have 10 units on the map at once, being able to select multiple units to direct them to the same location makes the whole process easier. The second point is one that I think has multiple possible solutions, and it was that by the end of the game I was tired of the battles feeling all the same. Some ideas for changing that: individual maps could have more terrain differences or enemy variety, or the game could have fewer overall missions which would help alleviate the repetitiveness, or a combination of both. I don't have a particular preference, but I think the game would have a stronger finish by focusing on spicing up the later game combat. Finally, I do find mission rewards based on how you complete the map is a great system. Like Valkyria Chronicles though, Unicorn Overlord's reward system incentivizes speed above all else, and I think that's to the detriment to the overall strategy of particular maps. They could still give rewards based on speed, but they also could increase the rewards for defeating enemies and capturing locations so that a slow but thorough player could get a similar reward to a fast player. As for unit progression, I think that the progression was fairly steady and consistent throughout the game. One trend that I have seen recently in strategy RPGs is that for promotions, there is only one option, not multiple, and I think Unicorn Overlord could benefit from having branching promotions. This could specifically help with the characters with the same base class, and allow for more unit variety. One of the best things about Unicorn Overlord was the plethora of options for how to build your army, build your specific unit formations, and strategize, and branching promotions would offer another option to do exactly that. That is one option. The other option would be to give everyone a unique class, but considering all the generic units you can recruit to your army as well, the branching promotion strikes me as the less disruptive overall change for progression. Unicorn Overlord did embrace some of the social aspects seen in other strategy RPGs of this day, like Fire Emblem, and I appreciated the insights into the characters, but I do think there's more that can be done. The game has a very large cast, so I'm not necessarily suggesting more Bond conversations, but instead, they could take inspiration from later Valkyria Chronicles games and have side missions specific to certain characters. Give them a chance to get into the limelight and show off their backstory and the things that matter to them. Allow the player a chance to tackle a mission with a certain set of units, and they have to puzzle through a setup different from the one they're used to. I think that would boost a couple areas for the game overall when it comes to character writing and mission variety, and since this would be optional content, it would allow the more focused main story to still stand out for the players who didn't want to go for everything in one playthrough. On top of the social aspects, the romances were pretty nice. The ones that they actually fleshed out and wrote as romances. So in a sequel, they either need to pick and choose which ones are actually going to be romances and which ones are just not going to be available, or we need a protagonist who's willing to date everyone. As for presentation, there is very little that I think needs changing or even updating. The visuals are great for Unicorn Overlord. I love the aesthetic, from the character designs to the food served in the taverns. More games should follow this artistic style. I know it's not easy to replicate, but the results speak for themselves. Speaking of speaking, the emphasis on quality voice acting also greatly benefited the game overall. It helped make the characters feel more distinctive, which, as I touched on earlier, is something that they could still go further with, but the performances really carried the character writing. I also enjoyed the music, so the biggest change that I would look at for the presentation would be the UX change I talked about earlier with regards to battle. The game does fall into a lot of the menus within menus trap, but it's kind of difficult not to with the intricacy of the game's systems, and the optimization options help players who don't want to engage with that level of detail and micromanaging still play and enjoy the game. The presentation definitely has the fewest amount of areas I think need any sort of change. Usually this is the section where I speculate on a possible release date for a sequel. This time though, I'm going to talk about the likelihood of the game getting a sequel. Thus far, Vanillaware has never made a sequel, And while I think Unicorn Overlord has great potential for a sequel and for growth as a series, I don't think it would be enough to sway Vanillaware. These people are stubborn, hence the whole PC port stuff. However, there was an Atlas survey which asked players if they would be interested in a Unicorn Overlord sequel, and so the circumstances around a second game happening may be something like this. Vanillaware is once again struggling with money, and Atlas persuades the team to go back to one of their previous games to build off of the pre-established audience and increase the likelihood of the game doing well. Now, I don't wish for this because Vanillaware has been at their best when left to their own devices and ideas, but those are the circumstances I could see leading to a Unicorn Overlord 2. Otherwise, I think it is highly unlikely, but hey, other notable studios that never did sequels like Supergiant have eventually decided to do so once they found an idea they thought they could build upon. Unicorn Overlord definitely has plenty to build upon, and I would love to see the developers take another stab at refining and improving the formula. Putting aside the unlikelihood of it ever happening, perhaps we can one day get a successor game that looks at Unicorn Overlord and Ogre Battle before it for inspiration. A more focused story experience with more variety in gameplay and the same strong presentation could lead to an even better experience than the already compelling Unicorn Overlord. But that's just what I think. What do all of you think? Do you think a Unicorn Overlord sequel could happen? And if it did, what would you want from it? Let me know in the comments, give the video a like, and subscribe to keep up with my future videos. Have a great day, and happy gaming.